pitches for your final GDW challenge projects are next week in class. You need to be here while your group is pitching or you will get 0 on the pitch. So very, very important that you are here next week while your group is presenting. Not everyone needs to speak during the pitch, but it is expected that everyone in your group is here to answer questions and just support each other because, you know, it's the end of the world. And if you're pitching your game, it's a pretty cool thing, pretty big deal, I think, to reveal everything to your classmates. So make sure you come out for that. GDD2 is due, I believe, yes, next Friday, the 27th. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to email me as always. Rubrics and outlines are available for both on Canvas in their respective drop boxes. And if anyone in attendance right now is not in GDW, I sent out a message on Canvas to this effect, but you are still expected to do both of these assignments. You can self-organize however you like within the students that are not assigned to GDW, and my expectations will scale according to your group size. So if you're not in GDW and you decide to work alone for these, I'm not going to expect you to have the same level of depth and breadth in your GDD, for example, as I would from a group of 5 people. So just a note there. Can it all be CGI that in no way reflects the game? So basically, I'm not going to give you any rules for the visuals that you use during your pitch. I do expect you to have some visuals of some sort, but as long as it suits what you're talking, you could probably get away with that as long as, again, it complements what you're talking about. It would be trickier to do an effective pitch if you're using CGI that in no way reflects your game, but basically no rules, just do a good job of getting us excited about your game and giving us the information we need. And other than that, you have carte blanche on everything that you can do. And yeah, just as a note, just out of curiosity, since I see some remarks on this in the chat, typically speaking, if people aren't enrolled in GDW, it's a matter of scheduling or personal conflict, reduced course load, for example, some people have because they're working or something like that. So not everyone that's in all of your core courses is guaranteed to be in GDW. So you'll often hear this kind of as a footnote, and if you don't know why that's going on, there's a lot of kind of individualized reasons for that. While the program basically has everyone carrying the same courses the full way through, things like scheduling and etc. can just make it so that some people are usually not in GDW, and usually it works a bit differently. So if you find yourself in that kind of situation in a future year, despair not, for that is perfectly normal. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to post them in chat, ask me later, what have you. And without further ado, we shall get into today's lecture. It's going to be a brief one today. This lecture, under normal circumstances, would be given during a week where, you know, some of the class is kind of away at a conference thing, and then we've got some hybrid online stuff that we do normally. There's a video that I made for the class last year that I posted in Discord. So this lecture is pretty short, and we're going to have like a longer form activity in the end that will require you to sort of get into groups and communicate with each other a bunch. So we want to have as much time as possible for that. Okay, so phases of production is what we're going to be talking about today. Some of the boring stuff, basically the things you wish they'd teach you in your business courses that are specific to game development, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk a bit about managing your team, marketing your game a little bit, managing community, managing your relations with the public, with players, preventing an angry mob from coming after you with pitchforks a la Bethesda or EA. And we're also going to speak very briefly about a quick pitching review to make sure that your pitching skills are up to snuff for your presentations next week. Now, I'm going to level with you. There are no pictures relevant to today's content that are actually interesting, with very rare exceptions. But I like having pictures in the slides because it gives your eyes a break from text. So basically, get ready to see some pretty screenshots and pictures of cute animals, because that's how management lectures be sometimes. So I would like to start off today by asking everyone a question, and feel free to press Fs in chat if you'd like to share. I'd like to preface this by saying, don't call anyone else out. This is a learning experience, just kind of maybe some fun things to talk about. I would like to ask, what is the worst confusion or miscommunication you have experienced so far in a game dev related project, whether that's GDW or putting together a GDD or anything like that? What is the worst experience you've had, or maybe the weirdest experience going, we had no idea what was going on. I see Nico posting a quote in chat. The rules are what? So deciding on things, right? Nathan, would you like to share?
You know the moment where you're arguing with one of your your group members or whatever, and then it turns out you're arguing about the same thing for like 1 hour?
And you
Like you
both had
both
the
have the
same
same
idea.
point.
Yeah,
You both have the
yeah,
same point, you're just saying it wrong.
yeah.
Like
Done
both of
that.
you are just saying it wrong.
I remember. I remember one, I think 45-minute or like hour-long discussion I had in my group when we were in second year, talking about the positioning of a trigger box for a cutscene, and we must have gone back and forth on that for like an hour before we realized we all basically wanted the same thing.
Yep.
Hyder?
So this is back during the text-based board game, but at this point, not many of us were like super experienced with programming, especially programming with other people and combining code. And quite a few things ended up with implementations that didn't really meld well together. And so the last moment, because of course you implement each other's code like moments before you have to present. So it was just us panicking and being like, okay, we need to cut this feature. We need to completely rework how this works so that this can work with this. And obviously it was no one's fault. We're all inexperienced and it was the learning experience, but it's something that we all struggled with at the very end, and it ended up making our product a little bit worse at the end.
Right, so less of a communication issue and more of a production issue where that integration step just wasn't happening until kind of the 11th hour. Ricardo?
So this happened with our GW project with the text-based stuff. Basically, what happened was I think one of our members, the gatecracking wasn't working and it wasn't updating like our newest pushes. And this is one guy who he was working on something for like a week that basically we figured out like right away. Like we already had implemented the code, so it was like, oh hey, do you have your stuff now? I was like, yeah, I do. And we go in and it's like, oh, we already did this, and he's just crushed because he thought he was like doing something new, and he was like, oh. So I thought that was kind of funny when I figured it out.
Right, so having that kind of disconnect and maybe not necessarily working together on a problem that should have had more people on it to begin with so that you could kind of brainstorm and come to a solution together without finding all these different roads to basically get to the same place. Stephen?
So basically for the first GDW assignment, we were making a text-to-base game. And one of our team members went missing, and after we learned that he was playing Khan, we called him out. Apparently, it was his girlfriend that was playing, and he actually sent us a video of her playing. It's like we were dead confused. Like, do we accept this as evidence?
Right,
So,
failure to communicate.
Yeah. Yes.
Sivanesh?
So for the first GDW project for the GDD, we didn't know that we were supposed to do it on the same text-based game. So we did it on a completely different game, our GDD, and so
I remember.
yeah. So we kind of hurt because we worked so hard on it, and we realized at the end that it was all it was actually for the first game that we were actually making. So yeah, kind of sucked.
Yeah. It's a difficult lesson sometimes when there's, something that is communicated and then there's misinterpretation, and you know what? It happens though. Isaac?
In terms of confusion experience in GDW, I haven't had much, and I was trying to think of any like miscommunication or misinterpretation scenarios, and I couldn't really think of any. It's been pretty smooth thus far. However, there was one instance in our text-based that had everybody confused for a very long time, and it was very early in, and we were just trying to make a random generator, and we had this lovely ASCII nightmare show up that it was just creating like a random number generator, and I just messed it up in some way that filled the entire screen, like the whole console immediately, and like crashed itself. and it just filled with some symbols I've never even seen before in a computer. So many things in existence, and we don't know how it happened. We fixed it because I just did the random wrong, but we have no idea why it happened because it doesn't even make characters. So that was something.
Yes, the dreaded unintentional dump of binary information onto the screen. Just like when you open an exe in Notepad and see all the little null characters. I think we got time for one more. Colin?
All right, so in our entrepreneurship presentation, we got together at the beginning of the month, and then we all divided up our work, and then we were getting together like a few days before we had to actually present it, and then one of our partners just didn't respond to us and didn't say anything in our chat. So and we spammed them for days, and then basically we had to submit an assignment without that portion of it because they're just gone.
Right. So basically what I'm getting at here is that a lot of the stories that you've shared, some of them come down to the nuances of school projects in particular, but at a really high level, these generally relate to two main types of problems. One being a failure to communicate or some kind of ineffective communication or misinterpretation that happens somewhere along the way, which is something that we'll be exploring in this tutorial this week in what is hopefully a very fun way. So stay tuned for that. And the other being production related issues. So not knowing exactly what to do, maybe doing things in an order that doesn't make sense. The situation where someone's working on a problem for a really long time, and then by working on it together, a couple other people are kind of able to swoop in and solve it right away. And then you all arrive at the same place at different times, and there ends up being some wasted labor and things like that. So all of these basically relate to issues with communication and with production. So we're going to be talking about those things today. Hopefully with what you walk away from today's class, I'm not going to lie to you, a lot of getting past these sorts of issues is experience more than anything else. But hopefully these will kind of plant the seeds of you being able to overcome these issues in the future, and certainly avoiding some of the public relations nightmares and ultimate embarrassments that other game studios have suffered as a result of this type of issue. So to begin with, let's take a look at the game production process, at least as it's kind of traditionally represented. So here's a timeline of what game production typically looks like from idea to launch and beyond launch. And we're going to break this down stage by stage in a moment. So first, you've got what's called the concept phase, then pre-production before you actually make the game, then prototyping, which is when you actually start to make the thing, production when you finalize the thing that you're making, and then post-production. So basically, after everything is done, what you're doing afterwards, and then kind of post-launch, how you're maintaining it. So within each of these stages, your process will, or at least should, be iterative. So some of those issues we talked about with, having each of the individual kind of systems done by different group members and then all trying to integrate it at the end, that's not iterative development precisely. You might be iterating on each of those features, but the game as a whole should undergo an iterative development cycle. So ideally, you should be integrating everything as early as possible and then using source control so that you can actually kind of work on each of your parts of the game independently, refining those features while everything still keeps working together, so that you're iterating on a complete prototype rather than working on features in isolation and plopping them together at the end. So let's take a look at each of these stages in detail. First is the concept phase, where you select an initial game idea. And this phase can historically kind of be one of the most contentious, particularly in GDW, where everyone has their dream game that they want to make. And maybe you came in with an idea of a game that you've wanted to make for the past 3 years. And you think, yeah, sure, for my first GDW project, I'm just going to make this game that I've had in my head for the past 5 years. Usually not the best idea. You want to go with something simple, and even when you pick something simple with a small scope, it's still going to be 10 times what you realize you can actually reasonably accomplish within a semester, because that's how development works. But this phase is really where you kind of flesh out what you want your game to feel like at a high level. So generally speaking, what happens during this phase is you'll have lots of discussions, you'll be making notes and sketches, and you'll be deciding on the core experience of your game. You might make some really crappy prototypes to illustrate your point at this stage. In fact, it's generally best if you have time. You might be doing things like comparing ideas to other games as well, or doing a competitive analysis. Maybe if you're really not sure what type of game you want to make. You'll pool some ideas from everyone's favorite games or games that are kind of similar to the feel you're going for, and you'll just try and pull out and mix and match elements of their designs to come up with your own ideas. So it's likely and encouraged that your core idea that emerges from this process will really evolve through discussion, kind of an iteration of a sort. So I would not expect that, one person goes into this stage with an idea, and when everyone hears it, they go, yeah, that's perfect, exactly that, and then you just move on. You should be refining that idea and making sure you really nail down what you want the core of your experience to be as early on as possible. That way, when the time comes to make those higher fidelity prototypes, you don't have to go back and change these huge swaths of your design, at least not as much as you otherwise would have to. So the next stage is pre-production, and this is the stage which is focused on fleshing out your design. So more discussion, low fidelity prototypes. You might have paper prototypes. If you're working on a board game, you definitely will. If you're working on a digital game, you'll be throwing some stuff together in Unity. You'll be doing stuff like starting on your game design documentation, which again, remember, will kind of live on throughout prototyping and production, should be changing as your design changes. You'll be making technical decisions here. So something like deciding what game engine to use, that needs to happen really early in your process. If you're already in production and you're deciding to switch engines, you've put yourself into development hell at that point. You're also going to be planning out a lot of your production at this stage. Modern software development usually doesn't have as much of a concrete timeline. There's something called the Agile methodology, which is really popular in game dev, which we'll be talking about more next year. But what we're talking about here is basically kind of your standard game production phase that you'll see a lot of the time, particularly in kind of AAA development. So next phase, prototyping. This stage is where you go from mostly ideas to making those ideas into reality. So here you'll be continuing to refine your design and iterate over and over again as you work on fleshing out different features and how the experience actually plays out, while making minimal working examples. So actually in your game engine, actually in the build that that you eventually want to release, kind of making maybe little test levels where you can kind of look at how different sections of the game play out and that type of thing. So nothing that you make really during this phase is going to be release quality, maybe with the exception of some assets that your art team is working on. Your goal here is really to make sure that your design is working, that you're getting the basic technical features that you need implemented, and improve that design before really big changes start to get really expensive. So, if you imagine you're kind of making a first-person shooter and you decide partway through that the gimmick that you were thinking of doing, which is something related to time travel, isn't really going to work, and you want to pivot to this kind of synthetic world filled with sci-fi soldiers, your art team looks at you and goes, but we've been making dinosaurs for the past 6 months. You don't want that to happen later in production, so you really want to make sure that kind of those aspects of your design are fleshed out when you're in this sort of prototyping phase. Production. This is the part where you're really, really making the thing. So you're still going to have iterations during this time, obviously. You're going to be testing kind of continuously with possible users, but at this point, you've kind of shifted to a stage where you're not making huge decisions or changes rather, or huge additions anymore. You're more kind of focused on refining what you have, because if you've approached the previous stages properly and you've employed an iterative process throughout each, you've been doing things like playtesting your prototypes, there really should not be a case where you've gotten to this stage and you start testing with players again and suddenly you realize your game isn't fun. That's not going to happen so long as you were doing your due diligence in the prototyping phase and you weren't ignoring what your players were telling you. So in this phase, you're going to go through a lot of separate builds, each with incremental improvement. Again, obviously iteration, and 3 common terms that you've probably heard before that get used in the industry for different builds are these. So first is alpha. Alpha usually means that a game is playable from beginning to end. Some of the assets are placeholder. All of the basic functionality has been tested and play tested. It's basically kind of like the minimum viable product of the game that you could release, but some of the assets are kind of janky and it doesn't really look exactly like what you want the final release to look like. Beta is, typically speaking, almost entirely finalized except for bugs, of which there are usually plenty in a beta, lacking performance optimizations, and perhaps some balance issues. So if you've got a competitive game in beta, chances are some of the characters are going to be OP, some of the characters are going to need a bit of a boost. Usually when a game is in beta, it means it's ready to release to a much larger group of testers to try and find some of the more exotic issues and bugs, root those out, as well as things like balance issues and so forth. And lastly, we have Gold, so a game that is thoroughly tested and ready for release, or as it kind of goes in the industry today, a game that's kind of tested and ready to get a 50 gigabyte day one patch. Of course, in the olden days, as it were, before we had that type of thing, Gold meant it's going on the disc and then it's going home to you and into your console, so you couldn't really make changes after this point. These days, of course, that's been relaxed a little bit, which has led to some very questionable practices in terms of quality assurance, dealing with consumers, and our old friend scope creep, a term which you've probably heard in GDW, but in case you haven't, scope creep is a thing that tends to happen in this stage, which is very, very, very bad because changes get really expensive in this stage and you're working closer towards what may be a release date that you've promised to the public. But scope creep is essentially when things keep getting piled onto a design later on. You keep going, okay, well, you know what? We're hitting our targets, so why don't we stick on this extra feature? Because wouldn't players love it if we also added like a battle royale mode, right? Every game needs a battle royale mode. No, every game does not need a battle royale mode. When you start adding things this late in the process, all you are going to do is give your team kind of more work to do if you're meeting your targets or you're kind of getting in earlier than maybe you were expecting to on some targets that you've set internally. It does not mean you should be adding more. It means you should be working to refine what you have absolutely as much as possible. So that is scope creep in a nutshell, and this is the stage where that typically tends to happen. Now, once this stage is over, you've gotten Gold, maybe you've finalized your day one patch because this is 2020, you're not done yet as a developer. Post-production is where you maintain your creation. So after launch, or after you've gone Gold and you're just waiting for release even, you'll still need to continue marketing. You'll still need to listen to your community. You'll be providing updates, maintaining any online services, not just shutting down your servers after a year because your player base isn't quite where you wanted it to and you figure, we'll just kill it, our players won't leave us anyways. So that's what the post-production phase is all about. It's very important. It's perhaps less labor intensive, though I wouldn't say less important if you're working on a small kind of indie single player game. It is massively important if you're talking about a AAA multiplayer release that might have thousands or hell even millions of players to avoid disappointing post-release. But this stage is important. It is important to maintain good relations with your player base and keep good faith even after you finally put your product out there. So the question becomes, to avoid all of those types of issues that we were talking about when we were talking about confusion with GDW, and I'm sure all of the scenarios you have in your head right now about some things that game companies have done in the past to kind of sully themselves in the public eye or maybe piss you off personally as a player, the question again becomes, how do you make sure all of this runs smoothly? And we're going to talk about some general advice and hopefully some advice specific to GDW as well. The first thing I want to talk about is team roles and specialization. And maybe this will be particularly relevant to you if you're not sure what you want to do yet. If you're not, that's okay. I'm not sure what I want to do yet either, so don't expect to know for sure in first year. But here's some rules of thumb, at least to help settle on roles in GDW. You should love what you're doing. If you got pigeonholed into being the programmer because nobody wanted to be the programmer and you don't actually like doing it, that's bad. If you really, really, really love working with the people that you're working with, I wouldn't say just ditch them and get a new group, but try and spread that workload out a bit more so that you can have something to do that you really love on your project. And if ultimately your group styles don't kind of mesh together in terms of what you want to be doing, you might have to either kind of split up, bring on some new people, that type of thing. So what you really want to do in GDW, especially since you have this flexibility, is to make sure you're creating a role for yourself that plays to your strengths and your interests. Obviously, playing to your strengths will help you to create a better game and ultimately get a better grade. But really, it's almost more important in a sense to cater to your interests. Because if you enjoy doing something, you're going to be compelled to do that thing more, and then you will get better out of practice. So if you're a really good artist, but you really, really want to learn code and you're kind of bored of drawing sprites over and over again, if your passion is more to learn programming, then try and learn programming. If you love it and you keep doing it, you will get really good at it. Conversely, if you got pigeonholed into being the coder, but art is your true passion, make sure that you create a role for yourself where you'll actually be able to work on art. So this can consist of multiple specialties. In the real world, it's a bit more difficult to do this type of thing, but in the lovely, lovely world of GDW, you're in school, you can experiment, you can figure things out. It's perfectly okay if, one person does art and game design and a little bit of marketing, and someone else does a lot of marketing and a little bit of code and a little bit of music. All of that works on a smaller team like this, especially in an academic setting. So don't be afraid to request of your teammates, hey, I really, really like this thing. Can I please do some of this for our game? If you're unhappy in your role in GDW right now, and I hope no one is, but realistically speaking from experience, probably some of you are, don't be afraid to have an honest conversation with your team and make sure that you're happy with your role. You might be pleasantly surprised to figure out that someone else would actually like to swap with you as well. So work together as a team to figure out what works. And I would advise you also to start thinking about this seriously now, just because if you are in fact planning to be here for the next 4 years, which I assume all of you are, you don't want to get stuck doing something that you don't like. You especially don't want to realize, in third year, well, I really did want to do this other thing, but I was kind of too scared to speak up. It's happened, trust me. It may or may not have happened to me, and I don't want it to happen to any of you. And you might be wondering why at all it's important to even have kind of a role structure in your group. Well, really, it's because everyone trying to do everything is a mess. So everyone's splitting off and trying to make exactly 1/5 of your game, doing 1/5 of the code and 1/5 of the art, and then sticking it all together in the last week. It's not going to run very smoothly, and it doesn't suit iterative development very well, which is what you should be doing. So yeah, try and pick a specialization or build one for yourself that is interesting to you. And remember that you can specialize in more than one thing. You can be a programmer and an artist. You do not have to choose. It is a false dichotomy to kind of say it's just one or the other. So team roles and specialization. So here's just some of the different specialties you might love. You've probably heard of most of these. Maybe you didn't realize that some of these were an option, that there are, yes, dedicated people who do this in game dev. The bigger a studio, generally the more specific roles you will find. So if you see one of them here that's really niche that you're super interested in, it might be easier for you to do that full time if you skew towards working for a larger company in the end analysis. But if you're okay with having a role that is sort of multiple things, you can feel free to sort of stay indie and still rest assured that you'll be able to specialize in that as kind of part of what you do. Okay, so within design, you can be a gameplay designer. You can focus on level design. You can focus on kind of environmental storytelling. You can be a character designer. You can kind of design, progression and achievement systems and tech trees and all that kind of stuff. Depending on the size of a project, there might be a design team of 20 people working on all of these different subsystems. So it's not just a matter of, I'm a designer, therefore I design absolutely everything, UI, levels, you name it. At an indie studio, that might be the case. So if you really want to be a design generalist, you might have an easier time finding work at a smaller company. But if any of these areas is really, really what piques your interest, then there are specific jobs for this kind of thing out there. Within programming, it's not just the programmer. So if you really enjoy programming things like math and physics and graphics, which is more of what you'll get into in second year, then engine programming might be for you. If you don't like any of that stuff and you're not a big fan of vector math, and when someone says matrix multiplication, it kind of makes you want to throw up inside, but you still really enjoy programming, you might like to become a gameplay programmer where you kind of actually work on those gameplay systems. If you're really interested in build systems and stuff like that, you want to know how Visual Studio works, you want to make a new, better Visual Studio so that you don't have to spend 20 minutes wrestling an options menu, maybe you'll be a tools programmer. Being a programmer is not just one thing. Inside art, there's a whole lot of specialization. So even just within 2D, you might be a concept artist, you might work on sprite art, you might kind of be a 2D animator, you might work on visual effects and particles and that type of thing. Within 3D art, there's modeling, so character modeling, environment modeling. You might get into kind of animation and rigging characters. Again, 3D VFX, like volumetric effects like clouds and that. Maybe you're kind of a technical artist where you're programming these special things called shaders that manipulate what graphics look like on screen. So you're kind of a visual effects artist that both does traditional art stuff as well as programming. These are all different options that you have at your disposal. Within sound, which is something that is sadly neglected in this program a little bit, to be honest, though we're getting better, you've got kind of sound design, so actually figuring out what the soundscape of your game is going to be like, what's the atmosphere, what's the feedback, kind of recording an effects or a Foley artist, so actually making those sound effects that you'll be hearing in the game. Composition, so if you're a fan of composing music, maybe you play an instrument you've always noodled around with it, kind of putting together game soundtracks, actually performing music for games, all of this type of stuff. And then, of course, we've got a whole bunch of other positions. I can't name them all. There's a ton. You might want to go into writing. You might want to go into actually production management or user research, quality assurance, community management, where you're kind of interacting with players on social media and spreading the word about your game. All of these are different options for you in game dev. And I think based on this, you can kind of start to understand why there's so many different courses in the program that cover so many different areas. And yet we don't even really scratch the surface of some of these. Of course, you don't have to pick just one of these either. Maybe you want to stay a generalist, especially if you want to work at a really small studio or try and do one of those, one-man shows like Stardew Valley or the like. Being a generalist and knowing a bit about everything is still a viable option. So then now that I've talked to you about roles for the better part of 5 or 6 minutes here, let's talk a bit about communication. Some of this will be a no-brainer. Some of this might be a bit difficult for you depending on kind of how extroverted you are, maybe how well you know your group members, but basically communication is unavoidable in game dev. It's a really collaborative field, and I promise, even if you're sitting there going, I hate group work, I didn't know there was going to be a lot of group work in this program, either I feel like my ideas aren't heard in my group, or I feel like I'm doing more than my fair share, or I don't know how to speak up and take the work that I want, so people think I'm lazy, but really I just don't enjoy what I'm doing. Whatever you're thinking right now, just follow this advice and it'll get better, I promise. Okay, so communicate frequently with each other. Talk all the time. Even if you're going, okay, I wasn't doing so hot, so I don't want to talk to my group members because I don't want them to know I didn't get much done. Just be honest and open about it and talk to them. It's much better to have a group mate who's communicating with you all the time going, I kind of struggled with this. I'm sorry it's taking longer than I thought. It's better than falling off the map for a week. So just make sure you're communicating with your team. Respect one another. This goes without saying. Don't put someone down if they're not doing as well on their work. Don't treat someone as less than because, you're the programmer and they're just an artist. You'd be surprised how often that kind of toxic attitude can come up. Make sure you're respecting one another. And you need to speak each other's language a bit too. So teach each other about what you're doing. If you're an artist and you're figuring out some neat stuff in Photoshop or Blender and you want to tell your team about it, tell them what you're doing. Share it a little bit. Your team will learn a bit from you, and you'll learn how to communicate the specifics of your role a bit more effectively. Same goes if you're a programmer. If you're speaking to your team about the cool new random generator that you made and how you've populated the console with all this ASCII art and crashed the game in 200 milliseconds, which is a brand new record, you need to make sure that you're kind of conveying what you're doing in an understandable way to your team, and making sure that you're speaking frequently will help to ensure that. Be patient with one another. So this goes hand in hand with respect. If you're a programmer and you're talking at a team of designers about this cool new C++ thing that you just learned 2 weeks ago, they might not know it yet. Be patient with them. Likewise, if you're an artist that's trying to tell the programmer why it's absolutely impossible for you to export that image in the exact format with the exact pixel values they want because Photoshop won't do something that you need it to be able to do, again, just be patient. Make sure you're explaining things to one another. And if there's a frustration or a disconnect, be upfront about it. Don't just go, well, screw this guy. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and then go sit in a corner. Lastly, admit when you don't know or understand something. This is going to happen. We're all learning here. well, I'm learning from you guys too. It's true. So admit when you don't know or understand what's going on, and then just ask politely for something to be rephrased. That will help you, again, to just get along with your group. So communication is important to make things run smoothly, but honestly, it's also just worth it because you might make some of your best friends when you're in this program. I certainly did. Shout out to Josh and Owen. Peace. It might not even be your fault when things go wrong if you're not understanding what your group members say or something like that, and you're going, oh God, I guess I really didn't get it when the prof explained it in class. I'm just going to go and try and figure this out on my own. Just talk to each other. And even if it is your fault and you weren't paying attention, everyone learns differently. Everyone's allowed to miss things sometimes. Just make sure that you're being honest and patient with each other. Do not throw stones in a glass house, as the saying goes. Like, I would be very, very surprised if anyone here has never struggled to learn something for one reason or another, whether it's just because you learn in a different way than your standard class format, or because you were tired that day and didn't get what's going on. I know that's happened to me a bunch of times. So just make sure that you're communicating and being honest with each other. And it can be over absolutely any platform you want. Obviously, in person can't happen right now, but whatever you want to use, Discord, Slack, Skype. I mean, yikes, but like, it's a free country, so use Skype if you want. Essentially, communication is kind of golden. So, little discussion case related to this, and I'll just give it a minute to sink in, but as soon as you have something to say here, please feel free to F in the chat and let me know what you do. So here's a discussion case for you. The programmer in your group has come to you as kind of the management person in your group. The programmer says that the artists aren't packing assets properly, even though she's explained the requirements to them several times. The artists are insisting to you that they've listened and that the programmer is treating them as inferior and stupid, and they don't. She thinks that we don't know what she's talking about because she's just an elitist programmer. So what do you do here, Matt?
My first thought would be explaining it in a different way. Like, I know that a lot of teachers and TAs, when it's a concept that people are finding it hard to understand, maybe draw it out, maybe physically do it for them if the programmer knows how to do it. Because some people understand things in very different ways, so maybe just explaining it won't necessarily help them get it.
Great. So a very, very good point there. Again, being open about the fact that there's a misunderstanding, and instead of getting angry at anyone, finding a different way to explain the core of what's going on to make sure that the artists understand what the programmer is asking of them, and maybe the programmer understands why it's either been difficult or impossible to do things the way they expected them to be done. Ricardo, did you have anything to add? Okay. Yeah, no worries. Jonah, did you have anything different to say, or maybe something to add?
Yeah, I did. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I know this isn't doable in real life because of COVID right now, but one thing that the programmer slash artist could do is literally go over to the other person's desk and say, show me how you're packaging these assets. And then you can look for the exact step that that person might not be following and say, here's the problem. Or give them an example and say, look at this sprite sheet. I need these sprites to be in this order. Like, if you hand them an example
Perfect.
or show or like do it with them, then it's going to be way easier than like miming it out over text.
Perfect. So making sure that both sides of a misunderstanding have they have access to the exact same information about what's going on. It's entirely possible in a situation like this that, in terms of the actual technical issue that's happening, nobody is at fault. Perhaps something has just been misunderstood on both sides. Making sure that everyone involved is able to see what's going on is very important. And I would like to just point out, and Jonah, obviously, yes, this is not as easy right now because of the world that we're living in, but something like a screen share call via Google Meet or Discord or something like that could still allow you to make sure that everyone has access to the same information and everyone's able to witness that workflow. So if this type of thing happens, say, during your final GDW challenge, and Hopefully the artists aren't going to feel like they're being treated as inferior in this case, but you can kind of orchestrate a call together with everyone to make sure that you're looking at the exact same thing and you figure out a workflow that works for everyone. And in this case, I would say as well, make sure you're talking to everyone kind of individually. Figure out if there is kind of a disconnect there where the artists have been treated as inferior, or maybe there's been some disrespectful commentary going on. And then you could maybe kind of have a one-on-one with the programmer in this case if that was true, and then make sure that everyone just kind of understands to respect one another and to keep a level head, as frustrating as game dev can be sometimes when you've had no sleep and you feel like you're talking to a brick wall. So just make sure that everyone is essentially communicating with each other. Great ideas there from Matt and Jonah, and Ricardo as well, who I believe had kind of a similar idea to Matt. So related to all of this, we talked about the idea of scope creep a bit when we were talking about production phases. So I would like to speak briefly about that as well. So if you haven't heard of this term before, scope is not just a delicious minty fresh mouthwash. It is also referring to the size of any given project. So the rule for scope is, generally speaking, start small. Try to start small. In reality, most developers, all developers, let's be honest, will overscope. AAA companies overscope, indies overscope, students overscope. Everyone overscopes everything. That's just the rule. So be prepared to cut. Essentially, don't start small and then plan to go bigger. Start small and then be aware that you will end up going smaller, because things always have to get cut. And don't add anything without cutting unless you're done absolutely everything. If you're done everything 6 months early and it's perfectly polished and you're basically gold, and you think, well, there is one thing we could add that's, and it would take us 2 months to do, go for it. And if you have to roll back, then you can roll back. But generally speaking, this is probably never going to happen. Even then, if you are done everything, it's usually best to focus on polishing what you have. So instead of kind of adding on more features, game modes, everything like that, try just making sure what you have is better, better, better. If there's a texture that was done that was kind of slipshod, that doesn't look so great, and the artist goes, okay, you're not making me make any new assets for a new feature. I had to rush some of this stuff because we didn't know if we were going to finish. Now I can go back and clean it up. Likewise, if your programmer was working on your input system and you just barely get it working, it's standing up like this Franken monster thing, and you always wish you could go back and just kind of clean it up a bit. If you're done everything, now's a good time to go back and clean it up a bit. It's probably way better for you in the long run than just tacking on additional features. So you'll be learning more about this in your business courses, particularly next year when you take project management, but it is definitely something to be aware of, just so that when you inevitably in GDW start cutting features, you are aware that it is normal. And that idea of scope creep, kind of new features coming in later in a production cycle, is also referred to as feature creep. So if you've heard those two terms, they basically mean the same thing. A concept very related to scope, what you're trying to get done, is the idea of when you're trying to get everything done, aka timelines. So you should be setting some goals for your team that will help you plan out different stages of development. You want to estimate in general how much time tasks will take, and having kind of a timeline for that can help you make sure that you're meeting a target that makes sense in terms of any deadlines you have, whether that's a release date for a commercial game or a deadline for an assignment. And it also helps you to coordinate the work of different team members. So planning out who is going to do what and when. Mostly these are going to be guesswork at the end of the day. You'll be learning some formal methods for putting together timelines in second year. Realistically speaking, though, my general kind of Cole's Notes case of this is, in your GDW, you can have some rough idea of, we want to be done kind of the minimum prototype for our game a week or two before the expo, so that we actually have time to test. But aside from that, rather, you're probably going to have really kind of little groups of things that you'll try and get done every few days or every week. That's kind of like a proto sprint, sprints being this method that's popular in that agile development thing that I mentioned earlier, which is basically just the notion that you should be doing small chunks of things quickly, as opposed to having some master grand timeline that's 2 years long and, a month in, it's already pretty screwed up to the point where the whole thing is now out of whack and inaccurate. So the idea behind kind of agile development and having these smaller timelines and only kind of a vague sense of when stuff absolutely needs to be finished is generally better for things as complicated as game dev, because when that wrench inevitably gets thrown in your plans, you're not ruining that much planning work. So here's another discussion case. And yes, this may give you some echoes of Cyberpunk here. Let's say you're working towards alpha. The project right now is taking longer than planned. And at the current rate, you're going to miss the release date by 6 months. So you've got a few options on your hands here as a manager. One is to postpone release. One is to start working overtime. One is to cut more features. One is to hire more people. So in general, which of these ideas do you think are good? Which of them are bad? What would you do? And feel free to F in the chat if you'd like to speak out loud. Though I see a lot of people kind of talking here, postpone, but don't say a release date. So yeah, that can be a really good idea. If you're not sure when something's going to be finished, postpone it and avoid promising a really optimistic release date to your public early, because a public delay can look kind of bad. Not as bad as enforcing mandatory crunch, mind you, but internally that delay isn't going to hurt as much as long as you have the financial runway to make it. Ahmed?
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hello. You do it all. You postpone, you hire, you OT, all of it.
That is definitely one approach. I would say in general, and this is just kind of my own. Sometimes overtime might be unavoidable. If you're a really small studio, you have no money left, and you definitely cannot ship what you have. But in general, you should try and always, always, always avoid overtime, or as it's more commonly called, crunch, just because bad labor practices are ultimately, generally speaking, not going to result in a better product. And more importantly, you don't want to put your employees and your teammates through that. But doing a combination of things, you are right, can be very good. So cutting some features and postponing release in this case, probably the best idea. If you don't have the money to hire more people, it's not a feasible solution. But doing things like trying to control scope a bit more and giving yourself some additional time to finish is generally a good idea. I think we had some other, I know Jonah and Matt had a chance to speak on the last case. So Nathan?
I think if I think you should just I think delaying is the best choice as well. But I feel like if you hire more people, right? Which I think is I think I heard it was a common tactic. I think that causes a lot of financial loss, because you have to pay all the new developers and you also have to lay them off after, because
Exactly.
you don't need them after. That's what I heard. And then if you lay them off, that's a big issue. Anyways, I feel like the money that you use towards the hiring new developers instantaneously can affect your long-term plan, and also the maintaining the game in the post, if you're updating the game after release. So that's going to be an issue.
Right. So things like bringing on maybe a couple of freelancers to do some work to help kind of finish in that final stretch, not necessarily a bad thing. Hiring new positions when you know you can't keep those people and it's just going to lead to a bunch of layoffs, terrible idea for multiple reasons. We don't have time to get into all of them. But Nathan, you're definitely right there. The money that you spend on those people also could be used for something else, right? You can use that money to pay your existing hires for some extra time and postpone release. And I see a couple comments in chat mentioning that crunch is a good idea. Crunch is never a good idea. It's always, always a bad idea. So unless you're, say, an individual person, you know what you're getting into, you're putting yourself through it, that's a decision that you can make for yourself. I would say it's not a good decision because it's basically proven to death at this point that under crunch conditions, you're not nearly as productive. So you're not actually going to end up getting a significant amount more done. But more importantly, if you're the head of a studio, you're making this decision for other people. If you're enforcing crunch or a culture where people feel compelled to crunch to feel like they're part of the team, that's a very toxic work environment. And you're going to end up with a burnt out workforce. You're going to end up with people quitting. You're going to end up with terrible reviews on Glassdoor. It is never, never, never something that should be your first idea or your best idea as a manager. And generally speaking, even if you risk losing a bunch of money on a release, unless your home and the homes of your employees is at stake because everyone is going to get fired and lose their jobs if you postpone, if you can afford it at all, you should never be crunching, not even a little bit, because that it creeps in. If you look at any company like Epic, for example, that has that crunch culture now, a little bit creeps in at the start, and it's, oh, we have unlimited paid time off. But then the people that work 45 hours a week are more respected as the people that do more work. And before you know it, you've got exposés being written about you on Kotaku with employees that worked 100 hours a week before having a nervous breakdown and leaving the company. So it's never something that you want to have. And for anyone that's unfamiliar with the term, crunch basically refers to a period of kind of intense, typically unpaid overtime that game developers will undertake towards the end of a production cycle to finish a game by a planned release date, where otherwise the game would not be finished to the spec that it was planned to be finished to in terms of number of features and polish and that without crunch. Now, honestly, in production cycles that do enforce crunch, usually that kind of stuff still ends up happening. There are still some features cut at release that were supposed to be there. There's still a 60 gigabyte day one patch. There's still a bunch of bugs with the game. Crunch really rarely has more of a positive impact than it does a negative impact on your employees. Okay, so, and yes, Dante in chat, if that sounds illegal to you, surprisingly, it's not illegal everywhere. It is illegal in Poland, which is why CDPR has to pay for their mandatory 6-day work weeks right now, but it's not illegal everywhere. Okay, so some general management tips. And I know we'd normally be taking a break around now, but since the lecture content today is kind of short, we're basically going to go right to the end of the lecture, and then you'll just have the remainder of the period to work on the activity. So some general tips here. Make sure work is distributed equally. A game studio is like the glorious Soviet Union. There should be equal distribution of labor among the working classes. Make sure you're helping each other out and don't micromanage one another. Just because you're kind of the management side of the team or you happen to be the most experienced programmer doesn't mean you should go around telling everyone else exactly what to do. That's a good way to spread bad will and to make sure that you're not going to have kind of some of those creative individual solutions that can make games such wonderful, interesting things to experience. Make sure your health and family come first. So this goes back into just saying don't crunch. This includes your mental health as well. So do not think that the game is the be all end all, and if it does not get done to the exact standard that you wanted it to, then the world is going to fall apart. It's much more important that you're able to actually stop working sometimes. And I know you're in school right now, so this is difficult, and I know it's already 6 p.m. right now, so again, this is difficult to say really, but so that you can actually stop working before 5 or 6 some days and just calm down, sit in front of a fireplace, play some games yourself. It's much more important that you maintain your well-being. Communicate with your team. We talked about this before. So most importantly, listen to everyone. Make sure that everyone is having an okay time working on the product. If some of you are close to breaking down, something needs to change. You want to make sure everyone has a choice as well. You can't just go, we're crunching now, that's it. We're all doing this. I'm saying this because we need to get done for GDW because I need my grades to be good. You know what? You can make that decision for yourself. You cannot make that decision for other people. Make sure everyone in your group has a choice. Now, of course, if people are choosing to slack off or you have a situation where maybe someone's dropped out of the program, make sure you're communicating with your GDW coordinators, your professors, myself for the assignments in this class, etc. Make sure they're aware of the situation. No professor is going to say to you, oh, 3 of your group members dropped out, better crunch. They're going to say, okay, let's cut some stuff. Let's come up with a plan. Thank you for telling me. We're going to figure out something that works for you. Maybe it's extensions. Maybe it's cutting features. Maybe it's like kind of tempering expectations for what the final product will be. Make sure you're communicating. So the last thing we're going to talk about before we kind of quickly review pitching is marketing and maintaining your public image and maintaining your games. So marketing is the act in game development of getting people interested in your game. It's essentially convincing them to play or buy your game. So there's lots of different channels for this. Social media is a big one, obviously. Developer blogs, still a thing, kind of having your own website or maybe publishing some articles on Gamasutra, that type of thing. Storefronts, so Steam, having a page up and going, wish list our game, please. It comes out next year. All that kind of stuff is marketing your game. Advertising as well, paying for ads on Reddit, having those weird, like, pervasive browser ads for a game called Ebony with the medieval woman in like the white dress and the gold armor that were everywhere about 10, 12 years ago. That's also marketing your game. So as an indie, basically the whole team needs to be involved in this. In AAA, typically speaking, if you're on the development side, you're never going to touch a single thing of marketing unless you're an artist and the team comes to you and says, we need you to render a scene for this digital poster thing that we want to make. But in AAA, you're probably not going to touch this if you're more on the design or the programming or the art side. If you're an indie, pretty much everyone is going to be posting screenshot Saturday on Twitter and that type of thing. So quick answers in chat. When do you think you should start marketing your game? When's an appropriate time to start marketing your game? When your game is complete. Excellent. So it really depends on the project. If you're making something small by yourself or like a game jam type thing, or you're just going, okay, I'm doing something for fun that's kind of a passion project and I want to share it with people, it's okay day one to go, hey guys, I'm thinking of making a game. I'm going to try and make a game. So I'm going to tweet some screenshots at you and stuff of my progress. That's okay. If you're planning an actual kind of big boy commercial release, it's usually better to hold off till you have that kind of minimum viable product, till you're well into the production stage and you actually have something to really show. Now, if you're students and you're trying to get yourselves out there as a portfolio, you want to show off at some conferences, that type of thing, perfectly okay to start earlier. Part of the big mistake that usually gets made is when AAA companies start marketing their games too early, and the problem becomes that there's a disconnect between what is marketed and what eventually makes it to market, simply because features get cut, the design you find out in playtesting does not work as well as you thought it would, etc., etc. As Colin has so aptly put it in chat, not 7 years before your release, cyberpunk, exactly. So you also want to ask yourself, basically, what does your community want to know? So thinking of yourselves as a player, what do you like? And again, feel free to post some answers in chat here. What do you like to know about a game before it comes out? What do you like to see? I know for me, I'm really interested in things like looking at in-development screenshots and concept art and that type of thing to kind of see how a game has evolved over time and to understand sort of what's changed and what the production process is like. You might want things like, just facts about the game, like playable characters, or check out this really cool, pretty screenshot, all that type of thing, right? So art getting mentioned quite a few times in the chat, right? It's a very visual thing that you can just see scrolling through your Twitter feed and go, ooh, that's really cool. I want to see more of that. Lore, right? Gameplay, characters, show them why it's fun. Great point from Isaac. So things like teasers that are very short that actually sell you on the gameplay and why you're going to have a fun experience. Very good things to have in your marketing material. Basically, the gist of it here is that different players will want to see different things. So feel free to just share things with your players. And especially if you're an indie, sharing some stuff that's kind of unvarnished, that's just early screenshots, or, hey, this is what this character first looked like and this is how its design evolved over time. You don't have to be under this super veneer of like everything is super polished and professional. Sometimes just talking to your fans or potential players and going, hey, here's what we've been working on, can be a really effective way of marketing yourself without seeming like you're just, standing there with a megaphone reading out advertising copy. So strongly related to the concept of marketing is something called public relations. And yes, that's GOTUS in the background, one of Peter Molyneux's disasters. Molyneux, he honestly does not deserve to have me pronounce his name correctly at this point, so I don't even care. Some shade. So public relations is essentially managing your communications with the public, your players. So you don't want to essentially overpromise and then disappoint people, or take a bunch of money, hype something up, and then just go, well, I don't care. You don't want to disappoint people and then disappear off the face of the earth. You don't want to lie to anyone. It's just all this type of stuff that you don't want to do. You essentially want to make sure that people think you're a nice guy, you're honest, you're a good development studio that's not going to take people's money and run, all of this type of thing. So this is essentially the process of kind of managing what people know, when they know it, and bringing feedback from the public back to your team to make sure that you can sort of, have that knowledge of what people are saying about you, so that just as your public does not have this built up image of your game that's inaccurate, you don't have this built up image of your fans that is inaccurate. So, going to start with a short video clip here just to show you what bad PR can get you. And then maybe we'll just kind of discuss some golden rules of public relations in general.
November 14th, 2018. The game goes live with a day one patch of 50 gigabytes. For fuck's sake, I'll see you tomorrow. But once that's downloaded, people start logging into the hellscape that is Fallout 76. And oh dear lord, they never fix the bugs. And there are so many of them. Goodbye world, goodbye necks, goodbye body, goodbye heads, bugs, bugs, bugs everywhere. Server crashes, game crashes, old bugs imported from Fallout 4. Use more than one nuke at a time, server's dead. Textures far too texturous, an all-consuming void. Error log 307. Can't pick up stuff, can't stop asserting dominance with a T-pose, frame rate problems, screen tear problems, getting too swole, getting underneath the map, getting attacked by invisible enemies, spawning too many enemies.
It kind of speaks for itself.
Spawning too many god rays. Also, your camp resets after every session, and sometimes it goes underwater. Holotapes randomly play static, but too many holotapes mean none of them will play. Enemy AI is far more A than I. Animations are broken. Surprise! Floating objects and a traveling merchant. Just to name a few.
Okay, so basically, if Internet Historian makes a video about you, you've done public relations incorrectly. So maybe that's good news. You know, either you manage your player base very well and everyone's happy with your game, or you do the absolute worst job managing your player base, but hey, you get to watch an Internet Historian video about yourself, which is pretty great. But essentially, we're going to be talking, very briefly about how you prevent this sort of thing from happening to your studio. So first, you need to know who your audience are. You have to understand your target market. Who is actually going to be playing your game? Where do they get their information? How do you communicate with them? How do they share information with others? What's the most effective way to get your message to them in a way that can be understood? This can change as your game changes. So who is playing your game might change as your design changes. Maybe you started targeting veterans, but you kind of want to make the game more accessible to people that don't have as much experience in the genre. And before you know it, you've got something that could be described as family friendly. Your target audience has evolved. There's a great resource for understanding the Canadian market linked here. I think it might be from last year at this point, but I'm not sure if the ESA has put out their full annual report yet. There's an American equivalent to this as well. So assuming you're kind of targeting this area of the world more or less, there's some publications that might help you out there. Obviously, if you're targeting internationally, you know, Europe, Asia, Africa, wherever you want to target, then there's publications available for different markets as well. Though North America is usually pretty easy to find stuff that's written in English that you'll be able to just pick up and understand quickly. So social media is kind of the big channel for communicating with your players, both in terms of marketing and in terms of kind of maintaining your image and communicating with players for concerns and things like that. So how should you use social media as a game developer? Well, this goes without saying, but don't use your personal account. You should basically link to your game or studio from your personal, and that is your professional personal accounts. If you've got an account that's, you know, full of weird anime memes and pictures of you know, big floppa and things like that, probably don't want to use that for professional channels, but you know, you do you. You want to make sure that you have quality content on your actual official game or studio account. You don't want to just be doing nothing but retweeting other accounts. You want to do things like screenshots Saturday and having kind of thoughtful messages about what you're doing on your game and that type of thing. People will share good content. So, you know, you might get a shout out on someone's Instagram story, or you might get retweeted if you have a really pretty screenshot, all that type of thing. If you have some quality content, people are more likely to share it. And having a few quality posts is better than just having an endless deluge of stuff that isn't super meaningful or super interesting. So this is things like striking visuals, interesting ideas, humor. These are all types of things that can kind of contribute to having quality content on your developer kind of public facing social media accounts. Try to keep at least a semi-regular schedule. So there are some tools like MailChimp for coordinating email lists, and Hootsuite. There's a couple other services like that now as well that can help you schedule posts on social media networks so that you don't always have to be waking up at 3 a.m. on a Saturday to hit the European market at lunch with the screenshot that you want to share. So these tools generally have free versions, and you want to try checking that out if you're going to really kind of be trying your hand at social media marketing. Respond and talk to your fans. So this is a big one. If someone @s you and goes, "Hey, I'm excited to see your game," don't leave them hanging. Make sure you're kind of actively engaging with your audience. And I know that kind of phrase in itself sounds really fake and phony, so try not to seem fake and phony when you do so. More about social media. Okay, so basic platforms, you guys know all this stuff. Just going to skip over it really quickly. Twitter is really easy to create content for. It's short. It can be really visual. There's a thriving, more or less, there's some drama, but there's a thriving game dev community on Twitter. Screenshot Saturday, Made with Unity, all of this type of stuff. Fan Art Friday, that's kind of related to game dev that can help you get your message out there. It's decent for reaching a lot of people. Your own website, right? So you have the highest level of control if you make your own website. It's a lot of effort to set up. But it kind of makes you seem super professional in that, so it's probably worth it if you have the time. It helps people take you seriously, so if you actually have a website in addition to some random Twitter account, then people will be more inclined to sort of consider you as a serious developer and not just another kid with a Twitter account that put some stuff together in Unity and said, "Here's my screenshot, everyone," and then disappeared for 6 months. A dev blog or articles on sites like Gamasutra. So if you have articles about your process in developing your game, if you're in this program, you're probably going to be forced to write blog posts and the like. Having some of that stuff and putting it out there can itself be a form of kind of marketing your game and relating to your fans in terms of how your development is going and that type of thing. Other forms of social media, Discord. So it's really great to have a Discord server for your game once you get a bit of traction. It is excellent as a post-launch tool. Look no further than the Deep Rock Galactic server for an example of that and kind of how they actually integrate it into the game a little bit, what with the unions of players and all of that type of thing. So having that direct communication channel for fans once you're a bit more established can be a really good thing to have too. Other platforms, so Twitch, getting people to kind of stream your game early or pre-release, handing out keys if possible. That's always a good way of kind of getting your name out there. On YouTube, you can do things like post trailers, you can create dev diaries, you can again have kind of streamers or personalities say, you know what, here's my game, maybe you want to play it, maybe I'll pay you a little bit as a sort of influencer marketing or sponsored stream type of thing. That can also help to get your name out there. On Reddit and Imgur, you can kind of post development progress. There's a few development communities on Reddit that can help you get some traction, some kind of presence on the web. You're probably not going to get a ton of new players that way, but it still is a good way to interact with the community. Facebook is kind of falling by the wayside these days a little bit, if I'm being honest. But it can be good for event planning, not in 2020, but in 2022 or 2021 perhaps. It's not as specifically relevant to game dev. Instagram is all about the visuals, not super relevant to game dev, but can also still get you some traction, get your content out there and that type of thing. Analytics, aka how well you're doing on social media, how well you're doing on social media. Many platforms will offer this for you to give you an idea of how many people are looking at what you're posting, how they're engaging with it, and so on. Typically, the way you'll use these, don't live completely by the numbers, but you can compare the success of different posts. Don't spend too much time looking at them. What you generally want to do is take a look if there's something that has a really, really high level of engagement, unusually high or unusually low. See if you can pick out some common threads between those posts that have a lot of engagement versus a little. Do people really like your visual posts? Is there perhaps a time that's working for you or a day that's working for you more just because of who your audience is? Analytics can be helpful for that type of thing. Basically, I would say analytics are probably most useful in terms of seeing what time you should post to maximize views, though obviously there are some kind of general articles about this online. I think Instagram is Wednesday mornings for whatever reason, and Twitter is like usually the lunch rush, but you can see those types of things online for yourself as well. So remember that even through all of this and talking to people and marketing your game, your priority as a studio is still creating a great experience. Don't agonize over social media, especially when you're on a small team and you have a tight timeline. If you're making something cool and you're making progress on that, it will be relatively easy to create compelling content. You take a cool screenshot, you put it on for Screenshot Saturday, and you know that's it. You want to put time and effort and love into your project more than you want to put it into your marketing. Once that time and effort and love is in your project, the marketing will come a little more naturally. Obviously, if you're a huge studio, you need to put a lot more time and money into kind of dedicated marketing. But as an indie, as long as you are getting yourself out there, you want to put the bulk of your efforts into your project. You want to make something great that you can show to people, not make great things to show to people and then realize that your actual something is not quite up to snuff. Public relations rather after launch. I guess I lied, Isaac. There is a Celeste reference today. So you're not done dealing with your players at release. You want to maintain your game. You want to ensure that any online features, especially in the case of a multiplayer title, are working. You want to make sure that you're not having problems with hackers or cheaters or griefing in your community, things like that. You want to fix anything that's broken. So if you get a flood of complaints at release about a bug in your game, you can't just say, well, I got your money, so that's it. Some companies do, but it's not what you want to do. You might want to consider adding new content as well. So the screenshot there from Celeste is from the Chapter 9 update, which was released after the game was out, after the developers had made their money, just to give some additional content to their fans. It's a great way to garner goodwill with the people that play your game. And ultimately, it's a way to, if you can afford it, just put more of your ideas out there into something that people are already interacting with and engaging with. You'll also want to be ensuring that you're kind of maintaining a good community spirit among all of your players. So listen to people's feedback, read reviews, don't get too caught up in it. Don't sit there and read all 1,000 out of 100,000 negative Steam reviews in one sitting and go, oh my God, my game sucks. But do listen to what people are saying, what they like, what they don't like, so that that can inform your updates to your current game and perhaps your future designs. You also want to monitor your Discord and social media. If someone's trying to reach out to you, it might be for something that makes you feel good. It might be for some criticism that's useful. So don't close off your ears. You want to make sure that you're engaging with your users as well. So civil discussion, responding to complaints in a sensible way, and that type of thing. Lastly, I want to address the concept of press releases. So this is particularly relevant if you're a larger studio with big news, and if any of you get into marketing or PR, you'll need to know how to write these like they're the back of your hand or something. But this type of communication is still useful to know about as an indie as well. So a press release is a short document created by an organization to share news with the public. So for example, we are pleased to announce that we have secured a publishing deal with, Devolver Digital or Xbox Live or, God forbid, Electronic Arts, that type of thing. Or, our position on loot boxes has changed for perfectly legitimate reasons. We said we weren't going to do it, but, we are, because we feel that it's a great surprise mechanic for players. And basically, you're covering up the fact that someone at your company went, money, 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 just put them in. So sometimes press releases are going to be sharing good news. Sometimes they're going to be covering something up. Press releases are kind of about maintaining how your image looks to the public. Might also be something like, our game is delayed, sad face. It's always better than, hey guys, mandatory crunch. Don't ask any questions. We said we weren't going to do it, but we're doing it anyway. Ha ha ha. So the concept of a press release, the purpose of a press release is basically to share information with the media and to maintain transparency. It's always better to get ahead of the story and share it with people than it is to have a disgruntled employee or a leaker share your information and then you have no control over the way the public perceives it. That's why press releases are useful. They can help you put a spin on anything that's negative or justify your actions, give you a chance to actually talk about what you're doing rather than immediately being vilified for something bad or having the hype train run completely out of control for something good. Basically, you want to get ahead of the story before it gets ahead of you. So the next slide is going to be a little bit of an info dump here, basically some rules of thumb for communicating with your adoring public. First, manage expectations. So you don't want to say, hey, my game is boring. Yeah, don't expect too much, because then people aren't going to be excited. a little bit of hype going, so we're making this game and this is what's cool about it. It'll help to get your name out there, and it'll make sure people remember to actually check in once your game is out on Steam or what have you. A lot of hype, though, is mostly going to lead to disappointment. People are going to build up this image of a game in their head that the real product couldn't possibly live up to, and then you're setting yourself up for disappointment and for players to think that you break promises and to have a bad reputation. Second, communicate early. So communicate proactively when you can, before something happens. If you do need to end up reacting to something that gets leaked or that you kind of forgot to tell the public about, shall we say, you want to do it as early as possible. You want to be open and honest as early as possible. The last one here is the big one. Don't lie. Just don't lie, ever. It's not just wrong. It's not just unethical. It will come back to bite you. It will damage your reputation. It will damage your goodwill with players. And this includes lies by omission, by the way. So if you say something is definitely going to be in your game and you have the intention of putting it in your game, but then 6 months later it gets cut, you need to make sure that players have access to that information, that it has been cut. Otherwise, you are effectively lying by omission to your player base, and that is not something that you want to have happen. So I've linked the Fall of 76 there again as well. There's quite a few videos on the internet to this effect that kind of talk about, a game company's fall from grace. Internet Historian is a personal favorite of mine for talking about various train wrecks that have happened both on the internet and in reality and with game developers and things like that. So I do recommend checking it out if you've got a spare 20 minutes to laugh at Bethesda. But basically, this is if you follow all of these rules, you'll be okay. If you violate all of these rules, you'll end up having the public image of an EA or a Bethesda, and that's not what you want. So before I let you all loose on the activity today, I just want to really, really briefly talk about pitching. So what are some of the things we talked about in terms of making a pitch great all the way back in week 3? Maybe you've gotten a bit of practice now at GDW reviews and that type of thing. What makes it good? Right, enthusiasm with an exclamation mark. I like it. It's the enthusiastic enthusiasm. Right, passion, confidence. So making it clear that you're interested in what you're talking about and making it seem like you know what you're talking about. Maybe some jokes, right? Subvert expectations. Put in something a little unexpected there to make your audience remember you, to give them a chuckle. Create interest. So saying things that kind of pique the audience's interest, talking about the unique selling points of your game. We talked about some other things too. So not seeming super nervous, making sure that you're using appropriate body language, being friendly, and that type of thing. Having some buzzwords, right? So don't overdo it, but having a couple of buzzwords that kind of get people excited and go, hey, I know what that is. Ooh, cryptocurrency. Yeah. Don't actually do that for a GDW game unless your game is thematically about cryptocurrency for some reason, but you get the picture. So on the flip side, what are some of the things you don't want to do during your pitch? What do you think could tank your grade next Tuesday on this assignment if you do these things during your pitch? Lying, right? So hyping things up for GDW, perfectly fine. You tell me something about your game that is abjectly not what I am going to see. Unless it's delivered with clear comedic intent, it's not going to fly so well. Stuttering, right? So being super kind of nervous or not confident, that's not going to completely tank your grade on Tuesday. You're only going to lose a little bit if you're super nervous on Tuesday, to be honest. You're all just starting out. I'm not going to be super strict on that. Sounding bored is a big one though, right? So sounding bored is something you will lose quite a bit for because you want to be enthusiastic about your project. And even if you're nervous and you hate public speaking, I expect that you'll at least seem interested in the game that you are making. Talking smack, talking down to the audience, right? Insulting the audience, not speaking clearly. Yeah, all of these things. So basically make sure that you don't bungle your delivery. Ariana, did you have something you wanted to add?
What about people who have a natural stutter as a speech impediment? They're like, it's not a nervous thing. It doesn't matter what their mood is.
Oh, yeah, no, that you wouldn't lose any marks for at all, obviously.
Okay.
If you're fumbling your delivery because it's clear you haven't really rehearsed and maybe you're not managing nerves at all, you might lose a little bit. If someone's presenting who actually has a bit of a stutter, obviously I'm not going to take off marks for that. Though I won't lie, in like a commercial setting, sometimes if that's not established beforehand, it can be a little bit tricky to follow someone who has a stutter sometimes.
Okay.
But in the context of this class, do not worry about it.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. And to that point, actually, just something to address that's kind of an elephant in the room. Sometimes, if you're a native English speaker and you've lived a really sheltered life, if someone is speaking who has a bit of a stutter or a really thick accent, you might have trouble understanding them. It's nobody's fault. If you're putting something out there in public, regardless of who is speaking, even if you think you're the absolute best native English speaker and you're giving the presentation in English, you should always caption your content if you're actually putting it out there, especially if it's just a couple minutes. It's not going to take much of your time. It will make it more accessible to anyone that maybe has some sort of hearing difficulty, and to anyone that has trouble understanding your accent or the particular way that you speak. Just having captions is a great way of getting around that. Obviously, for a live presentation, not as feasible, but just some food for thought if you have like a recorded pitch or a trailer on YouTube or something like that. Sivanesh, did you have a question?
Yeah. So like for shoot, I don't know why I'm stuttering. I already had this in my mind, but if you have a natural stutter, right? So say you're pitching in front of an audience, because like it's your, like everyone's joining that pitch. So so would we have to, would that person have to tell the audience before they start the pitch?
No,
About-
no, not at all. If you have any concerns about your particular situation and you want to make sure that I know about those concerns beforehand, feel free to just send me a message privately. You don't have to be in front of the class and like, I have a stutter, so I'm really nervous about this. You can if you want, obviously, but I would
mean,
say,
I
if
mean
you have
like
any
a natural
concerns,
stutter, like
yeah. If you have
yeah.
any concerns about that privately, you can feel free to address those with me. If
Oh
anyone
no,
in your
it's
group is,
I'm just asking, just in.
oh yeah,
general.
no, I just meant in general. If
yeah.
anyone has those concerns, feel free to contact me privately. And in general, if you do have a stutter or something like that, if you want to speak, go right ahead. I'm not saying you shouldn't be pitching it just because you have a stutter. Obviously not. Everyone who wants to speak should speak and have a great time. And if you're worried that maybe you might go over time if you have a stutter or something like that, again, send me a message privately and I'll just make sure that we have a bit of extra time added so that I won't be cutting you off. But if you feel uncomfortable speaking, anyone in the class, if you feel uncomfortable speaking because of a stutter or for any reason at all, you do not have to speak during your group's pitch. Not everyone has to speak. You just have to be here in the classroom. Basically, I'm going to take quick attendance via chat before everyone's pitch. So you do not have to speak at all if you feel uncomfortable speaking live for whatever reason, and you're not going to have your webcam on or anything like that. Nathan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think things like in pitches when you promise something like this is the best game ever we've ever made. This is the map is what Bethesda did basically. They just said the map is 4 times bigger. Everything is flawless. You shouldn't say that. Don't promise. I don't think you should promise.
Don't
to the extreme.
overpromise.
I think you should be like. I think you should be like modest and at the same time like it's kind of like a humble brag, right?
Yeah.
Kind of
yeah,
like
exactly.
yeah, kind of go like I think the thing you should go for, the vibe is like I think my greatest feature is my humility. I think that's the kind of thing they should go for. I think that's the kind of statement they should go for. They could go like it allows instead of going like this will allow for every player to have the most fun ever. I think they should say this will have a certain feature that will allow a certain feature to stand out more.
Make it sound cool without sounding like the absolute best thing in the world.
Mhm.
Make sure that you're not seeming overconfident. The last thing you want is, and to kind of paraphrase what you said, maybe the bad way to deliver this would be that classic, I think it was a 60 Minutes interview where Donald Trump said, "I'm the most humble man in the entire world." That is basically what you don't want to go for.
He said,
So yeah, just kind of managing expectations and
also
managing your level
saying
of
he
confidence.
said I'm the least racist person in the room with a black commenter in there.
What the things we could get into learning from politicians in terms of how to pitch and how not to pitch is really endless. But for your pitch specifically in this class, I would say pitch your game to all of us, the whole class. You're not just pitching to me. Basically, pitch to everyone as potential players. So the focus for this pitch is on your game's design, not your business plan. I don't want to hear some hypothetical revenue projections for 3 years from now as if this was entrepreneurship class. I just want to hear about the design of your game and why it's cool. So try to answer these questions basically. What do players do in your game? Why is your game original and or creative? Why would anyone want to play? And when you're kind of delivering all of this, just try and be confident, passionate, and excited, and you'll do just fine on this assignment. So after your pitch, ideally, anyone in the audience should be able to describe your game in a few sentences and have others find that description interesting. So you should be giving people enough interesting info that they could say, hey, I heard about this game where you do X, Y, Z, and someone else would go, neat. That's the kind of level of information that you should be going for in your pitch. So quick recap of what we talked about today. We talked about the different stages of game development. Each of these stages obviously will be iterative. It's not just a waterfall from beginning to end. We talked about some strategies for communicating with your team. We talked a bit about managing scope and how you actually talk to players and maintain your games after release. So a lot of this is common sense, obviously. Just make sure that you don't forget it and make sure that you're not getting, too caught up in the process and trying to get everything done on time that you forget not to crunch and to communicate openly with your team and all of that sort of stuff. So I will entertain some last minute questions about your pitches. I'm going to move forward and just introduce the activity for now, though, and maybe we can come back to this if there's a bunch of pitch related questions. So lastly, remember to fill out this form linked here and on Canvas if you'd like to request any kind of bonus topics to cover in the class. Next week, after we finish with all of the pitches, I'll maybe try and address a couple of them, or we can have some maybe sort of semi-structured discussions about those types of things. We'll see how it goes. And lastly, today we will be doing the activity which I have called Revisionist History. So you'll be working in groups of 2 to 5, self-organized. It can be your GDW groups. I don't care, whatever's best for you guys. Just make sure you're including the names of everyone that participated with your submission on Canvas. I want you to pick one of the scenarios over the next 4 slides. They are all real scenarios. You've probably heard of most, if not all of them. If you haven't, it's very entertaining stuff. Feel free to use the articles that are linked on those slides, or just look up other articles, look up videos, whatever you want to research about those cases is perfectly fine. Can it be 6? It can be 6 if your GDW group is 6, but if it's not, I wouldn't say start tacking on to a size larger than your GDW group. And my expectations will scale somewhat with the number of people. So I don't expect 2 people to say write as much as 6 people. And if you're 6 people and you hand in a page total for about the hour and a half that you have in class, you're not going to do quite as well. So basically, I want you to figure out a better way to deal with the situation at hand. There's kind of a prompt on each slide telling you where you're basically starting and what you're allowed to modify of what the company did, and basically talk about what your plan would be to navigate the situation. We'll walk through the first example in a second. Here's what you should include. Obviously, make sure to specify which situation you picked, but irrespective of situation, I want you to include the following. So first, a strategic summary of what you would do, a brief cost-benefit analysis. So I don't expect you to actually calculate anything, but basically, what benefits do you think your approach provides, and what will it cost? So is there any financial expense? Do you risk alienating some players? That type of thing. So what are the ups and downs of your approach that you would forecast? Comparison. So how is your plan better than what the studio actually did? Convince me that you did a better job or that you would have done a better job than the game company in question actually did. And lastly, I also want you to write a press release. So about half a page or so that you would release to the public or players explaining what's happening and why. So what would you actually want the public to read about this? This might leave out some details from your strategic summary or your cost benefit analysis. In fact, it likely would. This should basically say, what do we actually want the media to report about the situation? What do we want our image to be? Well, you know what? If you make the decision to lie, you're going to lose some marks. I'll tell you that right now. But you can make whatever decision you want in terms of what your press release actually looks like. I would also say indicate very quickly, this can just be like a sentence next to your press release of when it would fit into your plan. So when do you actually plan to release this information to the media? And I want you to hand in a PDF containing all of this stuff by tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. Basically, everyone in your group work on it. just do a Google Doc. That way you can kind of all type at once. Basically, probably one person per section, depending on how many people you have in your group. Discuss as a group, figure out your strategy, what you're actually going to do, take some point form notes, and then actually write up these little explanations for what you're actually handing in. Okay, so questions from the chat. Was it a yes for 6 people? Yes, but only if your GDW group is 6 people. Don't go over the size of your GDW group, basically, unless your GDW group is currently like 2 people or something like that. I really hope that's not the case, but if it's happened and people have dropped out, that type of thing. Can we lie about lying? Like I said, you can do whatever you want. I'm going to basically judge you based on whether I think what you're releasing is a good idea and if you're being grossly unethical about something. So if you're holding something back because it's not, financially prudent to disclose exactly how much something is going to cost you, that's fine. Lying to the audience to play with them a bit. If you've got something cheeky in your press release, that's okay, as long as you're not saying we're not going to do loot boxes and then you do loot boxes. That type of lie is not okay. If you're doing something that's kind of a jokey, tongue-in-cheek thing that's obviously not true, that can be okay. Depending on the tone of a press release, it might not be appropriate, but that's all right. So I'm actually going to stop the recording now. So bye if you're catching this later on. We are going to go through one of the options in a second just to give you an idea of what they look like if you haven't read through the remaining